In this video, I'm going to show you how to handle the spherical pendulum problem. If you don't know what a spherical pendulum is, it consists of a mass on, in this problem, a massless rod that has a fixed length and is connected to a point at the center of the coordinate system around which the pendulum can rotate to any angle. This is an extremely common problem in analytical mechanics for undergraduates, so I thought it was worth doing. For those of you who are used to my quantum field theory videos and my general relativity videos and quantum mechanics videos, that sort of thing, don't worry, I will be producing more of those videos at the same frequency that I already do. The reason why I'm producing videos like this in addition is because I'm interested in diversifying my YouTube channel. That way it's more fun for me and less tiring, and also I may have a chance of attracting a bigger and more diverse audience. So let's get to it. Here we go with the spherical pendulum. This is a table of contents showing what I will be covering and how it's broken down. In undergraduate, physics majors are regularly confronted with the spherical pendulum mechanics problem. It is so commonly taught because it's a great example of a problem that's very hard to do via direct application of Newton's second law, but is very easy to do with the Lagrangian formulation of mechanics. Given this, I figured it would be a good idea to make a quick video on it. Let's move on to calculate the equations of motion. As I said, it's very difficult to get the equations of motion via direct application of Newton's equations, but the Lagrangian approach makes it much easier because all we have to do is write out the energies and then take some partial derivatives, that being one of the central points of this problem. The Lagrangian whose extremum is consistent with Newton's second law in a constant gravitational force field in the z direction is this one right here. So we start with a standard Lagrangian for arbitrary Newton's equations, which is the kinetic energy minus the potential energy, and then we start plugging things in and expanding them out a little bit. This, however, isn't the full story. In the classic spherical pendulum, we also have the constraint that the pendulum length is fixed. It can move around at any point on the sphere, but the length is fixed, and it's actually that makes it a spherical pendulum. Additionally, the pendulum rod is massless, which is a usual approximation in this kind of physics at this level. This is a very difficult constraint to impose in Cartesian coordinates. This problem will be substantially easier if we recognize the spherical symmetry of the constraint in this problem and use spherical coordinates to describe the location of the pendulum mass. We will slightly modify ordinary spherical coordinates to pull this off. So these are ordinary spherical coordinates. Now we'll get to the modifications we're going to make of them. In the spherical pendulum problem, the z direction is measured down from the origin, so the first modification we're going to make is stick a minus sign in the z coordinate right there. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to take r to be the length of the pendulum. When we're in spherical coordinates, what was a very difficult to enforce constraint is now super easy because all we have to do is set r equal to the value of the length of the pendulum. That's what makes this problem so easy in spherical coordinates. From these values of x, y, and z, we can calculate the x, y, and z components of the velocity. It's just a matter of using the chain rule and the product rule, and these are the results you get. Then we can substitute these and this z value into the Lagrangian to get the value in terms of these angular coordinates we're going to be using. That gives us this. We can then do the squares, and that gets us this messy result. Now, the first thing we can do to simplify it is recognize that the cross terms from the first two squares cancel each other. That gets us to this. Now, the next bit of simplification is quite easy. It's just a matter of using the Pythagorean trig identity repeatedly. So we factor this into that, and we see that this must equal 1 and that must equal 1. So then we get down to this, and then we can refactor it again to use the same identity all over again, which simplifies it further, down to this gorgeous Lagrangian result there. Now that we have a simple Lagrangian in the coordinates we plan on using for the problem, we can work on calculating the Euler-Lagrange equations of motion. So first, here they are for the two types of variables we've got. The partial derivatives we need to get the theta equations are these. Inserting them gives us this equation of motion. And then doing the same for phi gives us this. And this is why this Lagrangian mechanics approach is so critical for this. It would be really difficult to get the equations of motion for this problem, these things, by direct application of Newton's laws. But look how easy that was when we simply used the Lagrangian approach with the right coordinates. The constraint was easy to impose and the equations of motion were easy to calculate. With the equations of motion found, we can start our analysis. The first bit of analysis we're going to do is we're going to look for an equation that we can solve to get the minimum and maximum values of theta. It turns out the solution itself is messy and trivial, so it's not super interesting to actually do that, but getting the equation that you would solve is the interesting part. The Lagrangian is time independent explicitly, so we expect the energy to be conserved. Also, we see that this quantity here has zero time derivative, that's just a phi equation, and therefore it is conserved. Also, we can see that this quantity here is just the z component of the angular momentum. So it's really the z component of angular momentum being conserved that is the meaning of the phi equation. This allows us to do something kind of interesting with the energy. We can write this, which involves phi, in a way that doesn't involve it at all, because we know this is a constant of the motion, the z component of the angular momentum. We can use that fact to eliminate phi. We see therefore that we've obtained an effective one-dimensional system for theta with this effective potential energy. If we set theta dot equal to 0 in this equation, we find an equation that we would need to solve in order to find the minimum and maximum values of theta in terms of the constants of the motion. This is what we get immediately after setting this equal to 0 and then multiplying out the sine squared in the denominator, and then we can use some trig identities to write it like this. Now there's a reason for writing it like this, and that reason is because it makes solving this very obvious, at least how you would do it. It doesn't make the algebra any less messy. So we can take cosine equal to x, and then this is just a cubic polynomial set equal to 0 that we could then solve in principle with the cubic formula, which is super nasty and complicated, and it's why it's so messy that I'm not going to do it here. But once we've done that, we've got the values for x, and then we can just take the inverse cosine of them to get theta, which means it's fundamentally trivial, if extremely messy, to actually solve this equation. This is where the interesting part stops, and where the trivial messy stuff starts, so I just didn't bother. That's the first bit of analysis we're going to do with these equations. The second one is perhaps a little more interesting, and that is the small motion approximation. It's the spherical pendulum generalization of the small angle approximation you do on the simple pendulum. Given the crazy nonlinearity of the equations of motion, it is interesting to explore linearizing the equations for small and slow motions around any points of stable equilibrium. Our first instinct is to ignore anything nonlinear in the small variables, and we will try that first, but it will turn out to be too much of an approximation. To get a completely sensible set of linear approximated equations, we actually must expand to the quadratic order, as you will see. In this system, naturally, stable equilibrium consists of the pendulum motionlessly positioned downward in the z direction. Remember, at the beginning, we flipped the z-axis. So we expect theta to consist of small displacements about theta equal to 0, and we expect theta dot and phi dot to be small as well. However, small and slow motions about stable equilibrium doesn't imply that phi will be small because it's the azimuthal angle. It does imply that the rate of change of phi will be small, but not phi itself. It also doesn't imply that the accelerations are necessarily negligible. In taking this approximation, we are therefore justified in ignoring anything nonlinear in theta, theta dot, and phi dot, but not in phi, phi double dot, or theta double dot. Phi does not show up in the equations of motion, though, and the angular accelerations only do so linearly, so we expect this approximation to completely linearize the equations. For this approximation, we will need up to and including the linear part of the Taylor expansion of sine and cosine about theta equals 0, which is these. Plugging these in and ignoring anything that is nonlinear gives these two equations. The first thing that we notice is that the phi equation vanishes completely at this level of approximation. This doesn't mean that azimuthal displacements are impossible, it just means that we have made too much of an approximation. We have eliminated important physics entirely instead of just obtaining a small motion approximation of the physics. Our goal is to approximate it, not eliminate it. Including terms to one higher order, quadratic, gives the following equations. And now we see we have a sensible set of decoupled linear equations. This is a much more sensible set. The last step in the phi equation derivation is justified because the initially yielded product must be 0 all the time, and theta squared isn't usually 0. It is only at best sometimes 0 for a brief instant. Specifically, we see that we have a simple harmonic oscillator equation for theta. Namely, it reduces exactly to the small angle approximated simple pendulum. This is satisfied by the usual sines and cosines, in this case with this period here. This makes sense given the definition of the angle theta. We can see that this just represents the small back and forth oscillations that we would expect of a slightly displaced spherical pendulum. Of course, phi can change, so it may not be just like a normal simple pendulum back and forth. You can expect that to rotate as well. Additionally, the phi equation tells us that we have constant azimuthal angular velocity, which of course is pretty intuitive for this kind of small motion approximation. And that is the spherical pendulum. I showed you how to set up the Lagrangian, change coordinates, impose the constraint, get the equations of motion, and do some important analysis with them. So now you know how to do the spherical pendulum problem. You know how to write out the Lagrangian, get the equations of motion, and analyze them in the two ways that we did. The first way we analyzed them was finding the equation that you solved to get the minimum and maximum theta angles. And the second thing was to take that linearized approximation, in which case the two equations decoupled, and one of them, the theta equation, turned into the small angle approximated simple pendulum equation, which was quite a satisfying result. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Dietrich out.